Hello, class. We're back for lecture number 13 for History 102, and we're going to pick up with President Taft, who we just covered his election in 1908. Now, a little bit about President Taft. We haven't really mentioned Taft yet in class. Taft was from the state of Ohio. And he was a brilliant law student. He attended Yale Law School. He graduated second in his class. He then went on to be a federal circuit court judge in the state of Ohio. After the Spanish-American War, President McKinley, also from Ohio, who knew Taft, will tap him to be the military governor of the Philippines during and after the Filipino insurrection, when we bought the Philippines for $25 million and didn't quite know what to do with it. Remember, we should have just cashed Andrew Carnegie's check. He headed up much the same thing that General Wood did in Cuba, a whole series of internal improvements, including the building of schools, hospitals, roads, electrification, and so forth. Then Theodore Roosevelt will tap him to be his Secretary of War. And he'll become one of Roosevelt's most trusted advisors during his 7.5 years in the White House. Roosevelt will, during this time period, will always refer to him as good old Will, is what Roosevelt will call him. Now, Taft had a golden opportunity to fulfill his lifelong dream in 1906, 2 years before he runs for the presidency, because an opening had occurred on the United States Supreme Court. And Taft had always dreamed that the culmination of his career would be becoming a Supreme Court justice, because law was his true love. Theodore Roosevelt called him into his office in 1906 and said, "Good old Will, I'm pleased to say that I'm going to help you fulfill your lifelong dream. I'm prepared to nominate you to be the next Supreme Court Justice of the United States." Now, Taft immediately said he was very honored, but then he said, "I need to go and talk this over with my wife." Now, the reason why is Taft's wife had other plans for the Taft family. She had her own dreams. She had always dreamt of being the First Lady. So, she talked her husband out of accepting the nomination from President Roosevelt and holding on because she was pretty politically savvy. She knew Roosevelt had promised not to run for another term and that in all likelihood he would not break that promise. And she knew if Taft made it be known to him that he was interested in being president and following in Roosevelt's footsteps, that Roosevelt would endorse him for the presidency. And as we know, that's exactly what happened. So, Taft will turn down this opportunity, and as his wife had planned, he becomes the next president of the United States. Now, I don't know if the class knows much about William Howard Taft, but Taft was a gigantic man. He was well over 6 foot tall, and nobody really ever knew how much he weighed because he would never tell anybody his weight. And guesses are that he weighed in excess of 400 pounds. He was just a giant man. And, unfortunately, one thing that Americans do know about President Taft was that when he was president, he got stuck in the bathtub in the White House because he was taking a bath and the bathtub sort of formed a vacuum around his body, and they had to break the bathtub apart to get Taft out of it, which why any of his staff members leaked that to the press is beyond me, but unfortunately that's one of the little quips that Americans know about Taft. Because of Taft's size and demeanor that we'll talk about in a minute, he got a reputation for being lazy, which he was not. Taft shied away from the limelight. Unlike Roosevelt, who's making a speech every chance he gets talking to the American people, President Taft didn't like being in the limelight, which is kind of odd for somebody being president, but he took it as a job that he needed to work hard at. His wife was more the face of the Taft family. So because of this shyness, and maybe he was a little self-conscious about his size or whatnot, people kind of thought he was lazy. No, he wasn't. He was a very hard worker. So, a few things about the Taft administration. One was his foreign policy. He, just like Theodore Roosevelt, had a lot of Ivy League buddies. He went to Yale Law School. He's going to tap a lot of his Ivy League law pals to be on his cabinet and help him forge his foreign policy. And the foreign policy that they will come up with, which is different from Theodore Roosevelt's preventative intervention or big stick policy, as many called it, is they're going to adopt the policy known as dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy was a policy where the United States, under the Taft administration, started using U.S. investment dollars as sort of the carrot and stick approach to persuading, especially third world nations, into adopting policies that the United States wanted, like democratic principles for their people. And they did this by telling the leaders of these countries, if they enacted democratic reforms, that the Taft administration would encourage Wall Street investors to invest money in that nation, which would be good for that nation and its people. And the reason why they would do that is because they'd tell Wall Street investors that they were a stable nation. If they went against U.S. wishes, then the Taft administration told them that they would tell Wall Street investors that their nation was too risky of an investment. So it was sort of a carrot and stick approach, using investment dollars to persuade countries to behave in the way that the United States thought was best for our interests and the interests of their people. It was a pretty successful policy, to say the least. Also, as far as President Taft carrying on with Theodore Roosevelt's policies, one area where he certainly excelled was trust busting. Now, Theodore Roosevelt gained the nickname of TR, the Trust Buster. But Taft and his Justice Department should have been the ones known as the Trust Busters. Because Taft, remember, being an accomplished attorney and judge, really understood the legal process. And his Justice Department, during his 4 years as president, will initiate 90 antitrust lawsuits against corporate America. Theodore Roosevelt's Justice Department, in his 7.5 years in the White House, will initiate just 44 antitrust lawsuits. So Taft and his Justice Department will initiate twice as many antitrust lawsuits in basically half the time. And there's two big feathers in Taft's cap as far as trust busting goes, which really should have gained him the nickname Taft the Trust Buster, but unfortunately it didn't. In 1911, his Justice Department filed an antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil Company. the Rockefeller monopoly on oil refining. And they successfully won, which forced them to break up that monopoly that controlled 90% of the oil refining capacity in America and would bring prices down. Also, and probably the biggest feather in his cap, was he successfully, while his Justice Department successfully won an antitrust lawsuit against J.P. Morgan's diamond jewel in his corporate collection, U.S. Steel Corporation, the largest corporation in the world. They won that suit, and U.S. Steel had to also break apart from its trust status. Now, the reason why Taft didn't become known as the Trustbuster is, unlike Roosevelt, every time they were successful in one of these suits, he didn't hold a press conference and tell America about it because he shied away from the limelight. Now, as you've already gathered, Taft is going to be a one-term president. And this is all going to start falling apart on him about halfway through his term as president, because he's going to split the Republican Party in two. One campaign promise that Taft had made that he will be unable to fulfill, and it's an area that Theodore Roosevelt never got around to dealing with, and that's the extremely high tariffs that still existed that came about during the billion-dollar Congress. He had promised to lower the tariff, and he was unable to get a bill through Congress that really did anything significant to lowering the tariff. And it's because part of the Republican Party at this point was still in allegiance with big business. The other half of the party were progressives like Taft and Roosevelt. And Taft could not successfully navigate this law through the House of Representatives, which was certainly controlled by the big business Republicans. And a lot of progressives felt betrayed by this and really said Taft was not a progressive, which, when you look at his trust-busting activity, he certainly was. Then, the thing that's really going to spell his doom is something that becomes known as the Ballinger Pinchot affair. Now, this involves, first of all, Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Interior Ballinger. And the other player in this affair, as it becomes known, is somebody we mentioned before in passing when we were talking about Theodore Roosevelt's actions as a conservationist or environmentalist. That's Gifford Pinchot, the forester. Now, there's a photograph of Gifford Pinchot in your textbook on page 664 in the Special Makers of America section, The Environmentalists. And that's Pinchot pictured center in that photograph with other foresters of the time. Now, he was the chief of the Forestry Department of the United States by this point, and he had been Roosevelt's top advisor on the Forest Reserve Act, as you'll remember. And what's going to happen here is Secretary of Interior Ballinger is going to put 1 million acres of federal forest land up for sale. Now, as Secretary of the Interior, he has the power to do that. But the problem was, when Pinchot heard about it, he immediately recognized that tract of land. Because what had happened shortly before Roosevelt left office in March of 1909, he and Pinchot had a meeting. They took a map of the United States that had federal forest land on it that had not been preserved by the Forest Reserve Act, the one that Roosevelt utilized so well. And they earmarked future forests to be preserved by President Taft, because Roosevelt envisioned Taft and Pinchot having a similar relationship that he and Pinchot had. And so far, it worked pretty well. Pinchot had advised him on different tracts of forest. Taft had used his power as president in the Forest Reserve Act and preserved those forests. And this is one that was earmarked for the future as far as Pinchot was concerned and Roosevelt had been concerned. But much to Pinchot's surprise, his boss, Secretary of Interior Ballinger, because the Forestry Department is in the Interior Department, puts it up for sale out of the blue. Pinchot goes to Ballinger and tells him that he really shouldn't do that. This is some very valuable virgin timberland that should be preserved forever. And in fact, he even showed Ballinger the map that he and Roosevelt had put together. Ballinger could care less. Ballinger tells Pinchot, I really don't care. Theodore Roosevelt's no longer president. If I want to put this land up for sale, I'll do so. So he does. What's discovered in further investigations by Pinchot, the reason why he's doing this is Ballinger is a very close friend of J.P. Morgan. Morgan's people have figured out that underneath this 1 million acres is an extremely valuable deposit of coal. So what Morgan's intentions are is to buy this acreage, clear-cut the timber, then strip mine the coal, which would completely ruin this virgin forest. You know, clear-cutting's one thing. Strip mining turns it into, when they're done with it, it looks like the moon. So, Pinchot is going to attempt to go over Ballinger's head, and he goes to President Taft and urges him to overrule Ballinger on the sale of this land. Now, just a little bit on how Taft ran his administration. He was sort of a hands-off person when it came to his different secretaries, like Secretary of the Interior, War, Treasury, whatnot. He gave them general directions on policy that he wanted them to pursue, but then he trusted them as experts to implement it. And he was not a micromanager in any shape or form, and that was his leadership style. So he told Pinchot, I'm not going to overrule them. I don't do that. I just direct these people, and I have to trust their judgment. So no, I'm not going to undermine him. If you are so committed to this 1 million acres, you got to talk him out of it. Pinchot tries once again, and Ballinger isn't interested. So what Pinchot does next, in desperation, is he'll leak this whole story to the press. That's how it becomes the Ballinger Pinchot affair. And what happens after that, Pinchot is then immediately fired for insubordination by his boss, Secretary of Interior, Ballinger. And obviously, Taft is not going to overrule his judgment. So, what happens next in this sordid affair is Pinchot now is out of a job. He decides in early 1910, he's going to go find Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, by this point, remember, in March 1909, he went on his African safari. Then he and his family went on a whirlwind tour of Europe, which they were still doing. And by this point, in early 1910, Roosevelt and his family were renting a villa in northern Italy. Pinchot figures this out, goes to the front door of the villa, knocks on it, and Roosevelt is stunned and surprised by Pinchot being in Italy. And I'm sure he asked him, what the hell are you doing here? And how'd you find me? And Pinchot basically told him all about the sordid Ballinger Pinchot affair. Now, this is sort of the icing on the cake for Theodore Roosevelt. some of the other policies that Taft had pursued so far in his presidency, Roosevelt didn't see eye to eye with. And this rift between Roosevelt and Taft had developed. Now with the firing of Pinchot, this was enough for Theodore Roosevelt. He felt like Taft betrayed him, that Taft was pushed forward to follow in his footsteps and hadn't done a very good job of it. Now, whether that's true or not, that doesn't matter. That's Roosevelt's judgment. So in the spring of 1910, Theodore Roosevelt will make his triumphant return back to the United States from his 2 different trips. And he'll make his famous New Nationalism speech in Kansas. In this speech of Roosevelt's return to the country, he basically says that there is a lot of progressive reform that still needs to be accomplished, and the job had just been begun by he, and that the only way to remedy the economic and social abuses that still were running rampant in our society was increasing the power of the federal government to be able to do so. That's his New Nationalism theme. So, what's going to happen next is Taft will be fulfilling out his next 2 years as president, and this is going to lead us to the wild and crazy election of 1912. Now, we'll begin talking about this just by establishing who the candidates are, because it's going to be a wide open, multi-candidate, crazy election. So, first of all, the Republican Party is going to meet, and they're going to end up nominating or renominating William Howard Taft, the sitting president, to run for re-election. Even though Theodore Roosevelt showed up at the Republican convention and let it be known that if they wanted to draft him and nominate him to run in 1912, that he was willing to come out of retirement and try to institute his platform of new nationalism. Now, the Republican Party has been split in two by Taft's actions over the tariff and the Ballinger Pinchot affair. Theodore Roosevelt represented the progressive wing of the Republican Party, and Taft, even though I'm not quite sure this made much sense, represents the conservative big business wing, even though he's the trustbuster. So you can see how complex and crazy this election is. The big business Republicans dominate the Republican Party at this point, and they have no interest in bringing back Theodore Roosevelt. So they nominate Taft. The Democrats will nominate Dr. Woodrow Wilson, the rising star of the Democratic Party. He's gained the nickname of the schoolmaster of politics. Woodrow Wilson, the son of a Presbyterian minister, will end up going to Princeton University as an undergraduate. He'll then graduate from the University of Virginia Law School. He will then later on become president of his old university, Princeton, in New Jersey, a very prestigious position. And then in his very first bid for any political office, he will be overwhelmingly elected to become the governor of New Jersey. And that's the position he'll hold when the Democrats will nominate him to be their presidential candidate. And he is the rising star of the Democratic Party. Now, the other two candidates in this election who end up being third-party candidates. I'm going to save that for the beginning of the next lecture, and we'll really focus in on this wild and crazy election of 1912. So I'll take a little break. I'll be back momentarily, and we'll pick up with, this is one of my favorite elections that ever took place, the election of 1912. So I'll see you soon. Take care.